So let me try to talk a little bit about the American economic crisis as I see it, where it's going. It's a lot to do in 20 minutes, but I shall try. First, the context, the history, the background. The United States is a very peculiar example of capitalism. It's not the norm. It's the atypical version. And that had to do with the fact that we didn't grow our capitalism out of a feudal background the way the Europeans did, or out of another kind of background. We are a peculiar society in which the indigenous population was ethnically cleansed, as you all know, when the Europeans arrived here, and established a peculiar kind of economic system here in a void, so to speak. They were refugees from Europe, and they wanted to do it, thank you, differently. And that produced in the United States a bizarre situation. A new kind of capitalism, quite successful, but it always had a problem from the beginning, from the time we became an independent nation. They always had one key problem in this economic capitalism. They had a labor shortage. They never had enough people. And this is crucial that you get this, because it's one of those many things about our economic history that tends to be overlooked in the school courses that you've all had. The Indian population, the Native American population, was unavailable because they were largely dead. And so they're not good to work. And that meant you had to bring people here. Now, we brought a certain number of Africans here against their will, by force, as you know, but the bulk of the population had to be brought over here by some lure. Whatever was pushing them out of Europe, they had to be brought by a lure. So successful was capitalism here, free land having been taken from the Native Americans, very fertile, lots of coastline, good climate, very successful capitalism, never have enough workers. So you had to pay high wages. Here comes the big point. You had to pay good wages. You had to pay enough wages to make people endure the trauma of leaving the cultures they had come from, the families, the connections, the feelings, all of that, to take a risky voyage across a dangerous ocean to a country whose language they probably didn't speak, with uncertain prospects for a job or any other way of survival. That's a lot of risk. There better be an inducement for that risk. And the inducement was high wages. Higher wages than were paid wherever these people came from. And not only did you have to pay higher wages to get them here, you had to pay higher wages once they got here to keep them. Why? Again, free land. If a worker in New York or Philadelphia or Boston wasn't happy, he or she could get relatively free land 100, 200, 400 miles west. Employers discovered they not only had to offer good wages to get the workers to come to the United States, they had to pay high wages, continuously rising, to keep them. Hence the following stunning statistic about the United States. From 1820 to 1970, 150 years, real wages, that is the amount of money paid for the average American worker for an hour, adjusted for the prices he or she had to pay, so it measures how much stuff you could actually buy, went up every decade for 150 years, rising real wages. No other capitalist country has ever done that. You produced in the United States, therefore, a bizarre culture and mentality. It had to do with the following. One, there is something absolutely unique about the United States. Not the story I just told, but something else. If you're religious, then God loves America, especially. Well, you do know that every politician who runs for office, you can see them on TV now, has to say that over and over again. It's a mantra. Well, that's not just a peculiarity of Rick Perry or something. That's our culture. There's something unique and special about the United States. We are a country in which if you work hard, you do well and you do better over time. And your children will live better than you and your grandchildren still better and all of that. It becomes part of our national culture. We are different from, we are superior to. Again, every politician has to say, greatest country on earth. What an obnoxious behavior. But you'd have to explain, since we all kind of understand that that's obnoxious. There's a wonderful line by that comedian Louis Black who plays a riff on this where he explains, can you imagine working in an office where somebody comes in and keeps telling you how they're the greatest thing on earth? You know, your instinct would be to push them out the window. It'd be unbearable. Why does the United States do that? It is obnoxious. If you ever go to Europe and talk to people who are honest, they'll tell you how obnoxious it is. Well, it's part of our history. It's our culture. There is something unique about the United States. It did pay higher wages for 150 years, every decade, even across the Great Depression, it's true. In those years, the wages went down, but the prices went down more, so they ended up with more wages. The thing I want to hammer home to you is, it's over. It's been over since the 1970s. In the 1970s, the labor shortage of the United States stopped. Now that's a trauma in a culture. I use the word trauma advisedly. I'm married to a psychotherapist. She's taught me what trauma means, and it's the word I want. Culture goes through a trauma. Consciousness goes through a trauma. The era of working hard and doing better, finished. There's no labor shortage. Americans didn't get paid well because they worked hard. They get paid well because there weren't enough of them. Hard as it is to accept that. But it means that when there are enough, you can work as hard as you want. You're not going to do better. You're going to do worse. Why did that happen in the 1970s? Because the world economy shifted. The very world economy that created this peculiar capitalism in the United States now shifted. What was it? Very simply, the computer removes vast numbers of people needed for work. Instead of 50 people in a supermarket keeping track of how many rolls of toilet paper we buy, we do a little scanning moment at the end when we check out. And one person looking at a computer in Boise, Idaho, can tell you exactly how many rolls of toilet paper have to be ordered by a supermarket in Brooklyn tomorrow. Number two, the United States, because it had paid higher wages, by the 1970s, had created, because that's how capitalism works, an immense incentive for American companies to look elsewhere for cheaper workers whose wages hadn't risen for 150 years. And there are lots of places that are eager to be candidates. So between the computer, which reduced the number of people we needed, and the export of jobs elsewhere, which reduced the number of Americans we needed to give jobs to, the shortage of labor was no longer a problem. And as if that weren't enough, we had two other phenomena. We had a very important historical movement. A vast new labor force entered the workplace looking for work just as the jobs shrank. The name of that labor force? Adult women, who, because of the women's liberation movement and several other things, moved into the labor force looking for work, real work. Not a part-time job here or there, not the pin money story, a real job. And we had the latest wave of immigration. This was not from Europe, from Latin America, basically. So you put together the women and the immigrants and the reduction of jobs because of computers and export of employment, end of labor shortage. And every employer in America knows, whether he or she has gone to business school or not, that the first rule of capitalism is, if you don't have to pay your workers anymore, don't do it. That's a smart move in the world of capitalism. That shows you're a sharp student of how the system works. Don't pay workers more if you don't have to. For 150 years, employers had to, for the reasons I gave you. Starting in the 1970s, didn't have to anymore. So guess what? They didn't. The real wages of the United States in 1970 stopped rising, and they have never resumed. The real wage of an American worker today, the average amount of money adjusted for the prices in 2011, is what it was in 1978. Very important you understand that. Not a statistic you'll see real often in the newspaper, but it comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, the official source for all these numbers. So there's no secret I'm telling you here. Any economist with minimum training has learned how to look at those BLS numbers, and there they are. So how did the American people handle this trauma? Badly. Because the trauma was never articulated. again, my psychotherapist wife, if you want to get through a trauma, you got to face it. You know, like if you go to an AA meeting, you begin, I have a problem, that's why I'm here. Well, you'd have to have had a culture that faced the problem. There had to be a culture in the 70s that said, hey, we're at a turning point in our culture. There's no more rising wages and not likely to be any. We had nothing of the sort. We're so busy being the greatest country on earth, we needed to pretend that nothing was going on. Which meant that every American working class family had to face this crisis without information about why it was happening, without an understanding of it as a social problem. And so they handle it as an individual issue. In case you haven't figured that out in life, you cannot solve social problems with individual actions. That's a mirage. Gets you into a lot of trouble. Here's how the American working class reacted to the trauma of change by individual actions. Two in the main. One, Americans began to do more work. You know, if you don't get more per hour, do more hours. And here's what the American family did. If the husband was working, he took a second job, maybe even a third one. The women, well, I've already told you, they had to go out and work. The teenagers began to discover the importance of after school and weekends, and the old people came out of retirement. OECD, a major international organization, statistic for you to think about. Americans do more hours of paid labor per year than any other working class in any advanced industrial country, including Japan. We work ourselves to death. No one does that. So the first reaction of the American family was to work, and above all to send mother out. Since mother had held together the emotional life of the American family, now she's as exhausted as papa, and everybody's working and getting on everyone's nerves. We've had 30, 40 years of disintegration of the family, not because of abortion. We've had disintegration of the family because we put our families under a level of stress and pressure that is unsupportable. And here's the irony. The coalition of Republicans and Democrats who pushed through all the steps necessary to have all this happen, to allow computers to be replacing people without limit, to allow corporations to move abroad without limit, to bring in the immigrants and all the rest. They then took no responsibility for any of this. Worse, one of the two parties figured out that since they were busy destroying the family, that would probably generate a nostalgia for the family, and one of the parties figured out how to use that to stay in power. That's called the Republican Party, which invented family values, that wonderful human tendency to celebrate with great intensity that which is no longer around, in the vain idea that if you support this party, it'll come back. Brilliant politics. What is the second thing the American working class did in the last 30 years to try to cope with the trauma of no more rising wages? Well, here's the problem. We'd all promised our children the American dream. We had kind of fancied we'd get it for ourselves. Nice home, nice car, nice clothes, nice vacation. You know the routine. Send the kids to school. With flat wages, that's no longer possible. So you work more hours. I've been through that with you. What's the second thing? You borrow money like there's no tomorrow. And in the last 30 years, the American working class became a pioneer in a new way, not crossing the great continent, but by borrowing money no working class in history had ever borrowed before. So by 2007, guess what? Our working class is physically exhausted, emotionally stressed beyond words by the collapse of the family, and now into debt way over their head, because it doesn't take a genius, and it sure doesn't take a PhD in economics to know that if the debts keep rising for 30 years, but the wages that have to pay for it in the end are flat, there will come a day, certain, when you can't cover your debts anymore. And 2007, that's what happened. And so we have a crisis that didn't behave like the other capitalist crises. You know, capitalism is an extraordinarily unstable system, always has been. But periodically, it has crises that are very deep, because it's not just your up and down, it's a society that has reached a point where it can't continue. That's where we are. That's why this crisis went down in 2007, and President Bush said it would be over soon. And then we had Obama, and he said it would be over soon. We're now the 5th year. It officially started in September of 2007. We're now December 2011, beginning the 5th year of this crisis, and there is no end in sight. Unless you think this is unusual for capitalism, it isn't. The Great Depression begins in 1929 and lasts until 1940-41, long time. The Great Depression that hit Japan in 1989 is still going on. So the idea that they always have to be short, wishful thinking. This is not a short one. This is already one of the longest we've had. And as I say, there's no end in sight. Okay. If I had time, I'd talk to you about how the bad news for the working class, the vast majority, has been spectacularly good news for the other side, the employers. So let me do real summary with you. If for 30 years the wages are flat, it's basically what we've had. And if over the same time the productivity of workers has risen every year a little bit, productivity simply measures how much stuff per hour is produced per worker. How many hamburgers, how many shirts, how many computer programs, or whatever. So the productivity goes up over the last 30 years. The wages are flat. Real simple economics. Wages is what the employer gives the employee. Productivity is what the employee gives the employer. So let's review. What the employer gives the employee is flat. What the employee gives the employer keeps going up. That's why we've had 30 years of prosperity. That's why over the last 30 years, the United States has become a much more unequal society, because the mass of people got themselves into debt, while a tiny number of people, those around the employing class, did spectacularly well. Stock market runs like we've never seen before. And if I had more time, I'd explain to you that when the American working class went into debt over the last 30 years, if you think about it, you might have had in your mind the flashing question, where'd the money come from to give them those loans? And the answer is, the extra profit the employers got because they didn't pay workers rising wages was taken by them and lent back to the American working class. For the employers, it meant instead of paying workers rising wages for this last generation, the way we've done for the previous 150 years, we've got a new kind of capitalism. We don't increase their wages. We drive them into debt. They're going to have to borrow for the weekly groceries. They're going to have to borrow to send their kid to college. They're going to have to borrow for everything. And they're going to be in hock forever. And if I had more time, I'd stop now and I'd play the national anthem. But we're pressured for time, so I will continue. Not only did the employers reap unbelievable profits, but like employers in capitalism always do, when excited by profits, they developed a mythology about why they were there. Quickly now. Mythology number one. This is not about not paying workers' wages increases anymore, because what kind of an achievement would that be to boast about? No. So we began in the 1970s, when this began, by developing the mythology of the genius entrepreneur. We learned names like Lee Iacocca and Jack Welch. Some of you will remember. Iacocca from Chrysler, Welch from GE. Books were written about. You saw them on television. Suddenly we were supposed to believe these people had become geniuses. Implication, they were morons before, but suddenly they became geniuses. And the reason these companies were making a great deal of money was they were so terribly smart. The stupidity of this is beyond words, but there is a method to the madness. Because what? If the reason the companies are making money is not because they're sticking it to their workers, which was the truth, but rather it's the genius of the top executives, then the logical follow point would be you ought to pay them for what they are achieving. So starting in the 1970s, we start paying our executives wild amounts of money. American executives are paid much more than their counterparts in Europe or Japan. So this has nothing to do with capitalism per se. That's the mythology here. This has to do with a peculiar moment of our history, which the executives have been grabbing ever since. 2 years ago, when the crisis hit, we all became upset about Goldman Sachs. And I'm glad. It's just 30 years late. Corporations have been stealing that money by their executives. Second thing they did, they developed fancy new instruments to make even more money by trading obligations, derivatives, asset-backed securities, all that stuff. And as always has happened in capitalism, they went crazy in their speculation. So by 2007, they had created a mountain of these new instruments, all of which had a particular thing in common. They were all new financial instruments based on the debts of the working class. Asset-backed securities means a security that isn't a share of a company making something. It's a share of a debt obligation in the society. Mortgage debt, credit card debt, car payment debt, college student debt. All of those things have been made into securities that are bought and sold by the trillions around the world. But they all depend on the ability of the underlying working class to pay back. But you created the impossibility for them to do that. And by 2007, the explosion happened. The speculations collapsed because they were premised on a working class whose debt level was unsustainable. It is a wonderful example the next time someone tells you about the efficiency of the capitalist system. There's not a story of efficiency. This is a story of unmitigated disaster. And the system that wants us to celebrate it when it is delivering the goods has to stand there and take it when it's delivering the bads, one after another, year after year. Otherwise, the claims to efficiency are hollow. Let me bring this to a close. We've been here before. This is not the first time. The last time, and the only relevant example to really use these days, is the Great Depression of the 1930s, when unemployment was greater than we've had it, at least so far, in this one. Bank failures very similar to this one. And what happened? Two things, two big lessons. Number one, we had a radical shift in the government's policy. Franklin Roosevelt was elected as a balanced budget Democrat, a centrist, we might call him today. Nobody with a program to deal with the Great Depression, even though that's what elected him. Should sound familiar to you. So now he's the president, but he's a president at a different time. By 1933 and 4, he's barely in there for a while. The level of unemployment reaches 25%, 2.5 times what we have now, or better than that. Terrible. And the demand for him to change policy and do something is loud. But a demand that's loud is one thing. A demand that's organized and loud, that's very different. And there were 3 organizations in the 1930s that made all the difference. One, the biggest surge in labor movement in American history. We've never had anything before like it. We've never had anything since. It was called the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. Swept across the major industries, auto, steel, rubber, chemicals, all of that. Suddenly there were millions of workers, joining unions and demanding that the government deal with the suffering of the mass of the working class. We also had very strong, powerful, and influential socialist and communist parties in those years. And together with the labor movement, in which they were the activists, they made the noise deafening, and Mr. Roosevelt shifted gear, big time. He went to his own people. Roosevelt came from one of the oldest, richest, best connected families you could come from in the United States. People who had already been president. He went to them and he split them down the middle. He gave them a simple message. He said, hey, I have to do something for the mass of people because if not, this system isn't going to be here much longer. So you better give me money, lots of it, your money, your wealth, your income. You got to give it to me so that I can take care of the mass of people. Because if you don't, coming down the road behind me are the CIO, the communists, and the socialists, and they're going to cut you a lot less attractive deal than I'll give you. And he split them. And so suddenly, they gave him money. I'm going to explain it to you in a minute because the numbers are stupefying. They gave him the money. So in the midst of a depression, much worse than today, instead of hearing, there's no money for people, there's no money to help people, the way we're hearing it now, the depression much worse. Here's what they did in the middle of the 1930s, the depths of the depression. They found the money to create, for the first time in the United States, an old age retirement program called Social Security. We didn't have that before. Suddenly the money was there to say to everybody over 65, here's a lot of money, forever, as long as you live. What? Yes, but that was only the beginning. Number two, we created the unemployment compensation system. Before that, if you were unemployed, tough. Go to church. Beg. Beg. Suddenly, if you were fired for no fault of your own because the company couldn't sell its output so they didn't need you, okay, the government gives you money for many, many weeks. There was no money. Of course there was money. But the best, in 1934, Roosevelt goes on the radio, makes a speech to the American people. If the private sector, I'll do the best I can, if the private sector cannot or will not hire the millions of Americans who want to work, then there's no alternative but for the government to do it. Between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled more than 12 million jobs. There was no money. Sure there was. The money was there because there was pressure from below that said, you better find it quick, or you're going to be history. And guess what? They found it. Here's where they found it. By 1942, here's the way the taxes in America worked. For every dollar that Washington got by taxing individual incomes, it got $1.50 by taxing corporate income. In other words, corporations as a group paid 50% more to Washington than the individuals. What's the relationship today? For every dollar that individuals pay to Washington, it collects from the corporations taken together 25 cents. Welcome to America. Over the last 50 years, we've had a shift of the burden of taxation from corporations to individuals. It's not that we in America are too highly taxed. You are too highly taxed, and I've just told you who isn't, but that's only half the story. Let's take a look at individuals. In 1950s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and for those 3 decades, what was the income tax bracket of the highest, the richest Americans? You ready? 91%. Let me explain what that means. For a rich person, every dollar over $100,000 that you earned, you had to give 91 cents to Washington. You got to keep 9. What is the tax bracket on the richest Americans today? 35%. From 91 to 35. That's a tax cut. So we not only shifted the burden of taxes from corporations to individuals, we shifted it from the richest to everybody else. Hard times for the working class. But not for the other people. Not at all. It's not that there's a shortage of money. It's that we have a government that will not tax corporations and the rich, not in the way of some fantastic socialist demand. We won't even do it the way we used to do it in the United States when we had a government of Republicans and Democrats both, because they both endorsed those tax rates. Not just Truman, also Eisenhower. Not just the Democratic Congresses, Republicans. They did it, and you know why? Because we had just been through a Great Depression, and we were going through, or had just been through, a Great World War, and we needed to rebuild our society from this great crisis, and so we had to call on everybody according to their ability to pay, and so we went to the corporations, because they have a lot of ability. Someone referred earlier to the $2.5 trillion, roughly, that they're sitting on. Yes, they got it. So we went to them, and we took it. A large portion of it. And they agreed with it. Well, let's be careful. Half of them. The half that Roosevelt split to go along with all of this. The other half didn't like it. And as soon as the war was over, the other half began to work real hard to undo the New Deal. That was the general name for all that had been done in the 30s. And as the time passed, as the Great Depression and the war receded in our memories, the business community that never wanted those things decided it didn't need to have them anymore. So the taxes on corporations went down the way I just told you. And the taxes on the rich individuals went down the way I just told you. And the government, instead of being seen as the rescuer of a failed private capitalism, was seen as the problem oppressing a private capitalism. And so here we are. All of the reforms, just about, of the Great Depression, undone in the 40 or 50 years since. They're right now in Washington writing the epitaph of Social Security. They're dissolving it as we speak. One of the great hallmarks of reform in the 1930s was a law called the Banking Act of 1933, otherwise known by the names of the two congresspersons who put it together, Glass and Stegall. It prevented banks from using their depositors' money to make investments. It split banks into depository banks and investment bank. Investment bank, Goldman Sachs, things like that. But they went to work to undo that, and they did it. In the 1990s, they finally repealed that, and our great President Clinton signed it into law. And 8 years later, the same financial collapse happened that led to that law being passed in the middle of the night. You have to shake your head in stunned disbelief if you haven't heard this story. And there are now, even more amazingly, there are now amongst us, maybe even in the room here, those who imagine that what we need to do about the crisis today is to regulate these banks and to regulate these Stop. We've been there. We've done that. That doesn't work. All that does is condemn us to watch while whatever we struggled enormously to achieve in the way of reforms is undone. There was a debate in the 1930s between reformers, the ones who did all these things, Social Security, the Glass-Steagall Act, all the rest of it, and a few, very few others, who called themselves revolutionaries, who said, no, not just these little reforms, this is not going to work. They didn't say it very persuasively, and there weren't enough of them. So they were defeated. And in the end, everybody did what Roosevelt figured out. They swung in behind him. The unions did, the socialists did, the communists did too. Whatever the rhetoric, that's what they did. They celebrated him. Today, by the way, the official position of the Communist Party, the little one that's still left in the United States, is to endorse Obama. So there's nothing new in that way. But the argument between reform and revolution in the 1930s has now been settled. The reformers were wrong, and the revolutionaries were right. It's not a question of, I'm not asking you to agree with this, but the revolutionaries said, this system will undo these reforms, which is what we have. That's what we have now. Every president, starting with Roosevelt, has made the following statement, including Obama. The measures I am proposing today to get us out of this crisis of our economy will not only get us out of this crisis, but, pregnant pause, but make sure we do not have this kind of economic crisis in the future. By that standard, every president's a liar. Every president has failed. Now, I don't believe that's because the president's at fault. You don't change the system, you get the way this system works. If there's a lesson here, it's the lesson that may be scary, but the alternative is childish. We have a system that doesn't work. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work here. It doesn't work in Europe. You can watch it. It doesn't work. It has now polarized the society into rich and poor, and therefore it doesn't make the basic recognition possible. You can't have 1% doing terribly well and 99% not, because it takes 10 minutes to show you that the well-being of the 1% depends on the other 99%. And therefore, if you screw the 99%, in the end, that's what you're going to do to the 1%. And here's the proof. When this crisis hit, particularly in the middle of 2008 and into March and April of 2009, a period of time when, I can assure you, at meetings just a few miles from here in Wall Street, some of which I attended, being the NASDAQ professor, there was widespread belief that the American economic system was going to stop. And by the way, stop. Not have a difficult stop. That means there would be no trains running. There would be a problem with food delivery into the city of New York, about which there were officials from the Bloomberg administration giving advice about how that would be handled. Just so you understand how serious it was. In the autumn of 2008. Between September of 2008 and March of 2009, there were large numbers of people in Wall Street who did not think we would get through this in the most dire language I have ever heard in my life, before or since. Decisions were then made to massively intervene. You have now been hearing, particularly recently, the Federal Reserve, according to Bloomberg, research forced out of them over their desire to avoid revealing it. Bloomberg went to court. Bloomberg, the news service, not the mayor. The news service went to court and forced it out by admission of Bloomberg, $7.7 trillion flooding into the American banking system. For those of you that don't pay attention to these details, the American banking system has been a nationalized banking system since then, to this day. Our banks cannot survive, not 5 minutes, without the government support they have now. I can see from your faces. One example, just so you get a sense of it. Over the last three years, 90% of all mortgages written in the United States, 90%, are either owned by the United States government or guaranteed by them. If the United States government didn't own or guarantee 90% of mortgages, the demand for housing in the United States wouldn't be there, which means that the price of your home would be half what it is now. The banks can't function without the government, and your wealth is immediately dependent right now and has been for years. So the idea that we live in a private enterprise system is pure ideological nonsense. We have a private system on life support from the government, which pretends that's not the case because of our ideological commitments. So for the last 3 or 4 years, we have recovered our financial sector. We have pumped unbelievable amounts of money into our banks, insurance companies, large corporations, and the stock market, where they play. For the vast mass of Americans, no recovery at all. Unemployment has stayed around 9%, give or take, for 3 years. We'll have more foreclosures in 2011 than we had the previous years. The level of benefits is dropping. The real wage, if you include benefits, is dropping. Job prospects are awful. And the consensus estimate for 2012 will be that it'll be a worse economic year than this one was. So stop. This is a failed recovery system. It services the people who control our politics. Last point. Over the last 30 years, if you've understood roughly the kind of picture I've painted for you, the mass of American working people were subject to unbelievable stresses. More hours of work, disrupted family life, if not disintegrated, levels of debt they could not sustain. Of course, they withdrew from social activity. They withdrew from political activity. There's a wonderful book I like to recommend to people by a non-leftist sociology professor at Harvard named Robert Putnam. Funny title, you'll remember it, Bowling Alone, the withdrawal of Americans over this period. He doesn't understand economics, which is a normal condition for getting a Harvard professorship. Anyway, I used to go there, so I really do know. But he's very good about this. He really documents it in the way sociologists like to do. But I have for you the explanation. American working people withdrew because they had to try to cope individually with the end of rising wages, the way I told you. So they withdrew from politics. Politics was no more the club, the neighborhood association, the little political. No. It's all television. You know. You've lived through it. We have politics by a different. The mass of people withdrew. The mass of Americans didn't stop being Democrats and liberals and leftists the way they had been in the 30s and the 40s. They didn't stop. They didn't change their minds. They withdrew. And as they withdrew because of their life situation in a capitalism that was screwing them, those with the money, who had the money because the workers weren't getting paid anymore, rising wages, took a part of that money and didn't just pay themselves high wages and didn't just speculate in derivatives. They also went and did the only thing a smart 1% gathering wealth into its hands would ever do. And that is to make sure that the political system didn't mess around with what was going on. So they went and they purchased the best democracy money can buy. And so we're surprised. Poll after poll tells us that the majority of Americans want something, and the Congress acts like they don't. And we keep on, what is that? What is that? There's no mystery here at all. Those Congress people, I talk to them from time to time. They even have me come and testify. They explain to me. I agree with you, Rick. But if I did that, I'd be out of office in 6 weeks, 6 months. What do you want me to do? Kill myself? I have to do that, but although I'm gone. And when I'm gone, they're going to have another person in there who will do what they want. So I get nothing. You get nothing. So let's just agree we're right, they're wrong. Too bad, go home. Which is what they do. And which basically I do too. But we have a system that is now articulated. That's why there was no agreement of that committee, the super committee, to work something out. Here's the concluding irony, and this is as true of Europe as it is of the United States. A crisis brought on by a system that doesn't work anymore. Fixed by a political elite, purchased by the same economic forces that brought us the crisis, turns out to do a surprising thing. Take care of the people who took care of them. Money to the banks and the insurance companies. Of course, they recovered the people who put them there to do that, leaving the rest of the American people to watch. But here's a little hooker that's a little fly in the ointment. When the government stepped in to bail out those who had brought us the crisis, it had to borrow a lot of money to do that. Because it's impossible politically to bail out the rich by taxing the mass of people. Then you would have had blood in the streets. They didn't do it. They borrowed it. And now they have to begin to deal with this enormous increase in debt, whether that be in Greece or in California or anywhere else. And so the question is, who's going to pay for it? And this political system built on this capitalist economy has the answer. You. You're going to pay. We're going to give you less garbage pickup. We're going to have fewer teachers and firefighters and social workers. We're going to have what in Europe is called austerity, and here we call it fiscal prudence. Sounds better. Same thing. Cut back, cut back, cut. We're going to wait. You're going to have to wait 2 years longer to get your Social Security. Think with me for a minute as an economist. We have record unemployment. We can't generate enough jobs to provide just employment for the new young people entering the labor force. What we should be doing is lowering the age of retirement so people retire, opening the space for those who need it most. Instead, the geniuses in Washington are raising the retirement age, keeping the old people in longer so that those of you that are young are screwed a little longer as well. very smart. This is not a question of smarts. The system doesn't work. And my final thought for you is it doesn't help anyone to pretend that the system is not broken. That does the job of those who want to keep it going for as much longer as they can drag it out. Capitalism is like that refrigerator that you've had for 40 years. And you call the repairman and he comes and he looks at you and he sees the sadness and fear in your eye. You want to be told it's just $30 to fix that motor. You want that. Your face radiates it. And part of him wants to sell you the crappy motor knowing you'll be calling him back in 2 weeks. But he's a decent guy. So he leans across your kitchen table and says, now don't get upset. You gotta get a new refrigerator. Capitalism is a system that we should have had debates about for the last 40 years. We didn't do that as a nation. We debate our education system, good, bad, how does it need to be changed? Our transportation system. Last year, remember, we spent all this time on our health delivery system and our health. We deal with our systems and we criticize. Good thing about the United, we do that. But not on the economic system. For 50 years, taboo. You can't question capitalism. It's so crazy that in my profession of economics, most of my colleagues teach about the system produces efficiency and equilibrium. Of course it doesn't, but they need to talk like that because there was a taboo. And you know what happens to a system, an institution, that you're not allowed to criticize for 50 years? It rots. It breaks down. We couldn't. And what we're doing now, thanks to Occupy Wall Street, is we're beginning to have the debate about our system that had we been a healthy society, we would have been doing for the last 50 years. We've got a lot to catch up on, and there ain't much time. Thank you very much. I thought the most important thing I could respond to was the question from over here about the options. Partly I didn't because you were so nice to put that quotation in your program there. But to change the system means you have to take serious steps. You're not going to vote in this turkey or that one, with all due respect, and there isn't much that's due. But in any case, I know it's attractive to imagine that we can go into a voting booth, and because that takes not much time and doesn't cost much, and if we could vote for Joe instead of Mary or vice versa, and that could get the problem solved, that's very attractive. Then we can solve a problem at a very little cost. This is not of that order of magnitude. Either you understand the level of difficulty we're in as a nation, or you don't. And I can illustrate it by referring to a couple of other questions. You are exhorted to do consumption, but the American corporations have already decided, I've been at more meetings than I bore you with, the growth of the market for American corporations is not expected to be the United States again for decades. The growth of the market is in places like Asia, Latin America, parts of Europe. They're growing faster than the United States because of the conditions we're putting our working class in. Americans cannot continue to borrow. They can't even sustain the level of debt they have. Their wages are not going up. They're flat to going down, which always happens in unemployment, and so on. So there's no growth here. If you're a company looking for growth of output, you're looking elsewhere. You're spending your advertising dollars over there. You're opening up offices over there, wherever there is. The United States is going through a long period of adjustment and decline. We're going to look like all those other countries we used to think we couldn't and wouldn't ever look like. We're well on our way. That's what's happening. The corporations are making those decisions and moves based on all of that. So yes, you go out and shop, but you're shopping also at the places that are not the big money items. You're shopping at the Walmart. The rest of the world is buying, I'm exaggerating obviously, but is buying more and more Gucci. The Americans aren't. Now, that's a problem. And that's going to be with us for a long time, unless we do what? Change the basic way wealth and power are distributed in the United States. And that's not going to be done by voting for one or another of these folks. because they're not relevant to any of that. They don't even talk about it. Look at them, watch them on these absurd debates. They debate everything other than what matters and ask us to take this seriously. We don't have to. The press does in order to keep the charade going. So what would have to be done? You'd have to do something so that the story I told you about the Depression, of all the reforms and all the changes and all the taxes that were levied and how they were taken away again and how the laws were undone, you'd have to do something about that. What does that mean? Well, we have a business organization that is the problem for us, at least a central part of the problem. It's called a corporation. And let's remember how it works. A tiny group of people control the bulk of the shares. Just so you know, 1% of shareholders own roughly 60 to 70, depending on how you count, percent of the shares. So shareholding is not a distributed phenomena, it's a highly concentrated phenomena. So the major shareholders are the ones who have all the votes. What votes? Shareholders vote for who the board of directors is. The 15 to 20 people that run every corporation. Those are picked by the shareholders. The workers may live with the results of what a board of directors does. For example, closing a factory in New York and opening one in China. Or using a toxic technology that destroys your lungs in 5 years. Those decisions are made by boards of directors. 15 to 20 people selected by the major shareholders. Another group typically of 15 to 20 people. They make the decisions that affect all the workers who are employed in that enterprise and all the people in the communities living around them. Guess what? For all boards of directors and major shareholders, the reforms passed in the 1930s, Glass-Steagall Act, high taxes, all of that, those are obstacles for them. They're hired to build the company, to make it more profitable, to give it a larger market share, to have it grow. For them, regulations, rules, reforms, taxes are so many obstacles to overcome. That's what they're paid to do. And what do they use to do it? The profits, which gather in their hands, because that's where profits gather. They gather as revenue to boards of directors. So to say this in abstract terms, but to summarize, a corporation has the incentive to undo reforms. And it has the resources to realize those incentives. It is stupid to reenact reforms, leaving in place the institutions we know must and will and have the resources to undo them. We've just been through that. If we do another set of reforms, it'll only go faster this time because they have the experience of the last 40 years to work with. It's crazy. So the solution, I would urge for people, change the organization of our enterprises. We have to do that. And the proposal for workers to become their own board of directors, to thereby socialize the enterprise, is the logical way to accomplish this. You know, and people have understood that for hundreds of years, the concept of the co-op. That's what that is. It may not get to this point because they haven't thought it through enough in terms of modern capitalism's crisis. But it's an old idea. And for those of you who take seriously, as I know most of you do from the things you've said, the concept of democracy, the corporation should be an embarrassment for you from the beginning anyway. Think about it. As an adult, you work 5 out of 7 days a week at a job, most of you for a corporation. It's the major thing you do in your adult life. If democracy means anything, it's got to be there. That's where you are as an adult. Democracy in the enterprise means those, like the old idea, those who live with the consequences of a decision ought to have the right to participate in making it. Otherwise, you don't have a democracy. But major shareholders and boards of directors, a tiny minority, have all the power. They decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Those are all the basic decisions. So if you're a Democrat with a small d, you should have wanted this anyway. But now I'm pointing out that by not democratizing enterprises, you're leaving in place an institution designed and provided with the resources to undo the kind of economic society we want and need to avoid the crises we're suffering from. This is craziness. And only a society that has this kind of political leadership, and unfortunately so much of this ideological leadership in our culture, makes us unable to confront what we kind of already know. If you didn't already know what I said today, you wouldn't have found it as edifying as you did. So it's not me. I've been saying these things for 40 years. But in the last, as I told you at the beginning, the last 2 years, I can't handle the flood of invitations. And they're not just from folks like you, who are already 3/4 of the way there. My biggest radio program that I do regularly is in Salt Lake City, a commercial AM station in which the man who invites me begins his program by saying proudly, I am a Republican and I am a Mormon. But you got to hear this Professor Richard Wolff. And then over the next hour, he and I agree on almost everything. The United States is not the society that the newspapers and the TV present to you. That is not the case. It is no more the case about our economic system than it is about the political attitudes of our people. The thing that surprised everybody is that Occupy Wall Street, in poll after poll, had a majority of Americans sympathizing with what they said. That is the strength we have to now mobilize. But it's already there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.